And I first came across, was exposed to Karen's work a couple of years ago when we were pitching our organization, Utah Foster Care, to a group of instructional design students at the University of Utah. And Karen, she wasn't actually there, but she had some colleagues there who were pitching a project that Karen wanted to work on. And I thought, oh my gosh, that sounds so great. And then just really, just very relatively soon after that, I came across her series that she has done with PBS Utah called Let's Talk. And Karen posted that link in the chat. So it's a little bit earlier, so if you want to scroll up to the beginning, you should be able to find that. But it's a wonderful short series. Each one of the videos are probably about, maybe 10, 15 minutes long. And it's a conversation between Karen and a couple, usually a biracial couple, maybe some ethnic difference, about talking about race and how to talk about race, particularly within the family and with children. And so I've just kind of followed her and been so impressed with her, and we're just very lucky to have this time with her today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time to Karen. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Hope you all had a good lunch and maybe a chance to take a stroll outside. I know these days we are very much cooped inside and staring at our screens, and so that sort of self-care is really important. And I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about a topic that people generally have lots of reactions to. And so we're going to explore a little bit of that. But the title of this talk is We Need to Talk About Race, Cultivating Positive Racial Identity and Building Cultural Fortitude. And I will kind of break all of this down. And I also invite all of you to chime in and ask questions throughout the presentation. And we will also save some time at the end. But I'd love to have a conversation with you. And I think it'll just sort of keep us all engaged when we can dialogue together. And in that spirit, I'd like to share a quote from Chimamanda Adichie, who says, "If you don't understand, ask questions. If you're uncomfortable about asking questions, say you are uncomfortable about asking questions, and then ask anyway." There are no wrong questions. We are all here to learn. And I can't see the 100 plus of you. I wish we were in the same room together and sharing a space. But I really invite you all to kind of bring any sort of curiosity and questions in, because it's important for us to dialogue. To start, I'll just share a little bit about me so you know kind of where I'm coming from. And as I share some of this material, you will kind of understand a little bit about why I might be interested in this topic. So I always start with where I was born and raised. I was born and raised in Hilo, Hawaii, which is a town of about 40,000 on the Big Island of Hawaii. Many of you may know it from the news. A couple of years ago, a volcano erupted and kind of wiped out an entire community. The Kilauea erupted, and it's been erupting for a really long time. And the Big Island is a very unique place, a very special place to me. And although I have lived on the contiguous sort of continents for most of my life, I still call Hawaii my home. And the Big Island in particular has been a very special place to me because both geographically, culturally, just community-wise, has shaped kind of how I see the world, shaped a lot of the way I think about relationships, about how I think about culture and race. I think also not to go unnoticed is I love the fact that I am from a place where it is literally the ground that I stand on is literally changing whenever I'm there as we speak. A new part of the island is forming. And so I like to sort of take that into my own sense of who I am as someone who is continuously changing and growing, as many of us are. So when we talk about this idea of race and racism, I think about it as a constant kind of place of growth and growing that stretches us, and that we are living in a time and place where we are being sort of confronted with what race and racism mean today. It has always been an undercurrent of the way that our country kind of operates, in the ways that our communities sort of operate. And so thinking about how our current landscape, our current climate is impacting who we are and how we are with others. And so that's a little bit about where I'm from. As Liz mentioned, I teach at the University of Utah. By training, I am a counseling psychologist. So I am licensed to see clients in therapy. Right now, my primary roles are teaching and research. And I get to do really cool stuff like the Let's Talk series, which to me is really the passion of a lot of, where I gather a lot of passion, which is around community engagement, being able to talk to people and learn with and from them. Okay, so where are we going today? Let me give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to be doing. So we're going to talk about race and racism. We're going to talk about tips for talking about race and racism and identity with our children, and really kind of bring the point back. Why does it matter? Why is that important? And then I'd like to share this concept of cultural fortitude and what that means and how do we develop that cultural fortitude. I'll define and then we'll kind of bring it to light. So to begin, the word race. So I'd like you all to sort of think about the word race and how often you talk about it, how often you use the word race. I'd like you to think about some of your earliest memories of when race came up. How did it come up in conversation? Or maybe as a child you observed something related to race or racism, and how it has shaped your views of race and racism now. For many of you, you may have received the message, don't talk about race. I'm not supposed to talk about it. It's a taboo topic. Some folks may have the sort of internal dialogue, well, I don't see color. Everybody is the same, we're all human. And underneath it all, we all have blood coursing through our veins, we all have a heart, and so I don't see color. For many of us, when we think of the word race or think about it in conversation, we think, what if I say the wrong thing? I don't want to talk about it because I might say something offensive, or people might get the wrong idea about me. I don't want to be a racist. And the other piece that I'd like to sort of contextualize us is that sometimes we don't think about race. Hold on one sec. As something pertinent, because the communities in which we grow up in, the people that we're surrounded by might be fairly homogenous. And so we don't, it's not sort of in the foreground of our thinking, because we consider sort of the topic of race and racism to be more salient when we are in a sort of mixed race context. But as many of you probably already know, that living in the state of Utah, we are experiencing lots of growth in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. And as you can see across the decade, many of our racial ethnic communities are growing quite significantly since 2011 and continues to grow. So the topics of race, racism, and ethnicity, I'll talk about sort of those. There's so many different terms, and part of the daunting task of thinking and talking about race is that there's so many terms we don't know which ones to use, and I will break down some of those terms. But living in the state of Utah, we can no longer say, well, you know, it's not that salient or relevant for us. We're a fairly racially homogenous state, but that is not the case, that we are diversifying and changing quite rapidly. And so while our population grows and diversifies, when it comes down to day-to-day experiences, we have to think about, like, how is that impacting our communities? How are our kids experiencing interactions with their multiracial diverse peers in their schools? How are we talking about these differences or similarities? So Utah is changing quite a bit. Okay, so now I've used the word race and racism, and many of us have different definitions of what that is. And so for today, I wanted to share the definitions that I'm working off of, so we have a place to start. So I start with racism because a basic assumption is that racism, the idea of racism, created the concept of race. So race didn't come first. So I start with the term racism, and what racism is racial prejudice, the idea or belief or assumption that there is a hierarchy, or that some races are superior to others, and that is fueled by social and institutional power. So those two together, those big sort of concepts together, those phenomenon together, are what creates racism. And another way to think about racism is a system of advantage based on skin color and phenotype. So then race is a category, this is right out of sort of dictionary, a category of humankind that shares distinctive physical traits. So the idea that, so race grew out of this social phenomenon, this social of racism, grew out of racism. So something that I also want to sort of highlight is the idea that these are what we call social constructs. And by that we mean ideas, ideologies, behaviors, actions, values that have been created by a society and impact our day-to-day reality. So it's a kind of paradoxical idea, the idea of race, because it is both made up, because what we have learned, and because of genetics and various projects around DNA, that we now know that there is more difference between people who theoretically share the same race in terms of their DNA than people who would be categorized differently. So there's more diversity within racial groups than there is between racial groups. Okay. So this idea of social construct, and how do we think about race as both a made up reality, because it impacts our everyday. The picture that of the two girls, these are fraternal twins. And so one, if you look at her, she might be categorized as, you know, multiracial, Black, whereas her sister, her twin sister, might be categorized as white, and yet they're both twins. So this idea of race being a social construct. The other distinction that I want to make is that sometimes we use the terms race, ethnicity, and nationality sort of synonymously, but race is how it's defined here, and ethnicity is a little bit broader, and it's more of a shared culture. So for example, I would be categorized as Asian in terms of my race. However, my ethnicity is Chinese. And that is different from nationality, which is sometimes folks, when wanting to talk about race, use the term nationality as a synonym when they might be uncomfortable talking about race, but nationality is your nation of origin, your country of origin. Okay. So sitting with these kind of broad definitions of racism, race, and ethnicity, I wanted to share some research about how it is we talk about race in the United States. So many of you may remember this game. If you don't, it's a board game that kids play, and there are two people who play the game. So there's one person who is the kind of describer, and there's one person who is the guesser. So in this picture, the person, the little boy who's sitting in the blue shirt would be maybe the guesser. And the person on the other side has a picture of someone. And the guesser has to sort of figure out and deduce who it is, who's the mystery person. And they have a number of times that they can guess. And the winner is the one who's able to guess it the quickest and kind of move through all of the characters the quickest. So a really, really neat sort of idea for a research project came out of Harvard University by Norton Summers et al. In 2006, where they used the same idea to examine how people talked about, how they describe people. So this is just a snippet of a larger Guess Who board. And so we have participants. There are about 150 participants. And what participants were asked to do is so there was one person who would be kind of describing, and then there's another person who's guessing, okay? So the guesser can ask all kinds of questions like, is the person wearing a hat? Is the person wearing glasses? Okay. They can do whatever, they can use whatever sort of questions they want to be able to, in their quickest number of turns, be able to guess who the person is. And so the experimenters really wanted to see kind of what are some of the descriptors that people used. So this is just 12 faces, but there were actually 36. Half of the portraits were of people who would be most commonly described as white. Half were most commonly described as black. So 18 and 18. And so this is what happened. So 57% of white participants with white guessers use terms black or white. 21% of white participants with black guessers use terms such as black or white. So reminding you, the quickest way to sort of guess, the object of the game is to be able to guess in the quickest number of turns. And we see what I find interesting is the marked difference between white-white pairs and white-black pairs, where white-white pairs were more, I would say, comfortable using the terms black or white, but still, almost half never used those terms at any point of the game. And less than a quarter of participants where there were white-black guessers used the term black or white. And so they both had what their responses were and how they asked questions, but they also had video of how they looked when they were playing the game. And across the board, a lot of discomfort, this avoidance of using these racial terms. And so the idea is that is very sort of, that permeates, and many of you could probably find examples or have been in a part of examples, is just this discomfort with saying the word race, saying black, saying white. being able to kind of identify someone based on those terms. Here's what's interesting too, that when they asked children to play this game, children under 9 were way more likely to say black and white, and that quickly shifted after age 10. So by 10 years old, the patterns of communication about describing people shifted to resemble adults. So the sort of take home is, if I don't notice race, then I cannot be racist. And so oftentimes, and this is just a part of kind of the way that we are with each other within the United States, that race is something that is almost everywhere. Racism, as we know, I mean, we're living in such a different context now where it really is even more in the foreground than it has ever been in a long time. But this idea, if we don't say race, we don't say the word racism, then we avoid or protect ourselves from being racist. I just want to stop briefly and check in if, Terry, there's any questions before I move on.
We had one, but Liz answered it. They were asking what REI meant.
Oh, yes. Yes, I was going to get there for your quiz, racial ethnic identity. I hope that I got it right. Did I?
Yes.
You did. Oh, you can't see me nodding my head, can you?
Yeah, no, that's okay.
There's a really recent question, Terry may not see it pop up yet, from Rachel. She asks if there's a difference between noticing and acknowledging race. So even if someone doesn't acknowledge race, doesn't mean they don't notice it.
Great distinction. Yes, and so we will talk a little bit about that because for the most part, like many of us in the U.S., we notice it. But then what happens after that is there are many other layers to that, and I'll talk a little bit about that sort of identity development and internalization of what race means, or when we notice it, what are some of our default behaviors? Do we ignore it? Do we sort of dismiss it? Do we address it and shine a light on it? So yes, definitely a difference. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
I just had a quick question too, and this maybe seems so basic, but it just sounds like a dumb question. Why are people so afraid of being called racist? I found that people get very upset about any idea that they might be racist.
That's a great question. I think that the term racist comes with, it goes against so many of our cultural values. And when I say cultural, I say America and the United States as a culture. That to be called a racist means a whole person is sort of the whole personhood is being attacked as being a bad, evil, malicious, and sort of person. And I think that if we can learn how to depersonalize and say that, yes, I might do racist things, and I know that I do racist things, but as a whole person, I am not bad. And so I think that there's this real repelling to this idea that racist means, people have ideas also of what a racist looks like. We have that in the media. And so based on who we've held up in media to be a racist, we remove ourselves from that. Like, I am not like that person. I'm not a racist. That's what a racist looks like. And so I think we spend a lot of time doing that. And, we'll talk a little bit about the shift from individual racism to more thinking about systemic racism and the way in which we're all a collective and a part of a system that is racist, and then how that can be a way to think about racism. Okay. So to put some language to the difficulty for some people to just talk about race, and really it's a lot about kind of what we grew up with, the exposure that we've had, and for people of color, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, you know, for those of you, I can't see all of you, it's something that you've talked about a lot. And you talk about it all the time. And so we have this sort of bimodal distribution where some people talk about it all the time because they're confronted with it as their everyday reality of being racial, ethnic minorities or minoritized groups. And then we have another huge group where they were never exposed to it, didn't talk about it. And so there's this huge gap there. And so I like this one quote where it says, growing up in the suburban Midwest, I never talked about race with my family. We were all white. All of our neighbors were white. And it never occurred to us there was anything to say about that. As a result, in later years, I developed a sense of shame whenever I talked about race. I realized that this shame came from the silence about race in my childhood. So a lot of kind of what we'll be sort of exploring today is how that silence translates into later sort of adulthood and interactions, how that silence also translates into the way in which relationships develop across race. So this silence that we talk about, the fact that we don't want to use the word race or racism, is quite paradoxical in the sense that we exchange race-based and racist currency every single day. It is everywhere. And part of it being everywhere is allowing ourselves to notice that and to kind of lean into that discomfort. That race is the currency that we exchange every day in this country. And from the earlier research study, you know, kids under 9, they get that and they see it. And kids see it from a very, very young age. They might not use the terms race or racism. I'll share a little bit about my research I've done in elementary schools. They might not use the term in the way that's supposed to be sort of defined, but when they describe their interactions, they describe their feelings, they describe the way they're treated, the way that they see others being treated, they see the implications of race and racism every single day. And part of our goal and why many of us are here today is to learn how to engage children in those conversations, provide them with language, which are really tools to build connection and not divisiveness. So the tools and language that we use to talk about race and racism are tools for connection, tools for empathy, compassion, and community building, not divisiveness. I'm going to share a video with you all about kind of demonstrating how young kids are when they start to think about race and start to internalize it. And it's going to start kind of a little bit in the middle. I don't want to show the whole thing, but you'll get a sense of how kids, what their language is around thinking about race. And it's a study that was done, I want to say maybe 8 or 9 years ago.
Ready, set, go.
Our second major finding, even black children as a whole have some bias toward whiteness, but far less than white children.
She'll be the smart child. And why is she the smart child?
Because she is white.
Okay. Show me the dumb child. And why is she the dumb child?
Because she plays.
Well, show me the ugly child. And why is she the ugly child?
Because she plays.
Show me the good-looking child. And why is she the good-looking child?
Because she likes skinny.
And show me the skin color you believe most teachers think looks bad on a girl.
I don't think they think it matters. Because I think each teacher wants to help a student learn either way what they look like, and it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside, it just matters what you look like on the inside.
Show me the good-looking child.
They look the same.
Yeah? Show me the child you would like as a classmate.
All of them.
You like all of them as classmates? Why do you say all of them?
Because I don't really care what color they have.
This 5-year-old girl gave some provocative answers during her test. I asked her about them later.
How about you? Why do you want that skin color?
Because it looks lighter than this kind, because this looks a lot like that one.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't like the way brown looks, because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason. That's all.
So you think it looks nasty?
Well, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes. And Brielle, they asked what color adults don't like. Do you remember what you said? Which one? That's right, that's what you said. Why do you think adults don't like that color?
Dark.
Dark. And you think adults don't like dark?
Well, maybe some adults do, but maybe some of them don't.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white-biased answers?
Show me the one you think most children would think looks bad on a boy.
More than 70% of the older black children chose the darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like.
More than 61% of the younger black children chose the 2 darkest shades.
Show me the ugly child.
More than 57% of the younger black kids chose the 2 darkest shades. Dr. Spencer says the research shows the bias toward white is still very much part of our culture.
All kids are exposed to these stereotypes, but what's really significant here is that white children are learning or maintaining those stereotypes much more strongly than the African American children.
And that is our third finding, the finding that interested Dr. Spencer the most, that overall younger and older children keep the same patterns stereotyping. In other words, their ideas change little from age 5 to 10.
Ordinarily, by the time children are older, there's sort of a natural filter, their own ways of thinking sort of aids them in sort of rethinking the extreme stereotypic sort of responses to become less highly biased.
That left Professor Spencer wondering what's causing this pattern. She speculates that kids are bombarded by stereotypical messages, and that adults in kids' lives have to fight to override the deluge. Black parents may be more diligent about that, while white parents may not notice the need.
The messages are the same for all children, and therefore the task is the same for all parents. Parents have to reframe what children experience.
We realize these findings may be disturbing and that some people will question this project's conclusions. What stereotypic messages are being sent in a country that elected a black man president?
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
Like all research projects, ours is not perfect. Some kids were told ahead of time they'd be asked about race. Some children identified as one race but came from biracial families, like this boy whose mom is white. But Professor Spencer tells us these are common issues in research and the results can still be trusted because of the sample size. To be clear, this is a scientifically informed and executed pilot study, which suggests the need for further research. The results point to major trends, but are not the definitive word on children and race. Still, they underline what Dr. Spencer sees as an alarming conclusion.
We are still living in a society where dark things are devalued and light things are valued.
The question we're left with is, where do we go from here? Anderson Cooper, CNN.
So before I move on, just wanting to invite any questions, thoughts, and feelings.
I have a question. So I'm raising 2 young daughters, one's 6, one is 2. My 6-year-old is white, blonde hair, very fair. My 2-year-old is biracial. She's both Caucasian and a black. And I feel like it's important to recognize the differences, but to teach them both the appreciation of what they are and who they are and where they come from. But I've had people tell me, no, you don't need to, you're overthinking it. Or they make comments like, well, she's Black, just that's all she needs to worry about. And I feel like this, like watching this study kind of reiterates why it's so important to me to appreciate the children, or to teach the children to appreciate what they are, but to also find appreciation in the differences as a beautiful thing. So like, even before I adopted my 2-year-old, I was teaching my 6-year-old when she got a McDonald's toy with an afro, it was a black little Barbie, that how beautiful the curly, thick, crazy hair was in comparison to her own. But like in this particular study, it showed that children of a darker skin were more noticeable of, like, they thought that the dark skin was bad or not as smart. How much of that, from your experience and the research you've done, is as a result of what they're taught at home versus what they're taught socially? Does that make sense? Like maybe the parents had certain experiences that were being passed down to their children. Is that possible? Like, is what we're teaching them at home going to make a difference in the way they view, or are they automatically coming up with these biases or these thoughts based on their experiences through school and social? I hope I was clear in my question.
You're very, very clear. And the stuff that, as parents keep us up at night is just wanting our children to grow up to love who they are and recognize that there's so much about who they are. They, have a racial identity, but they have other pieces that we want to really foster and bolster. But your question about kind of where the influence is coming from and where does the family fit within that influence, I would see it as all influencing. So from a very, very young age, children are watching the ways in which people interact with each other, from very nuanced behaviors to very explicit, pretty clear disparities in the ways that certain people are treated. What is on television? What are the books that they're reading? How do people say the word Black? Do they whisper it? Do they say it, in a neutral, sort of positive sort of way? I mean, kids are just picking up on all of that all the time. And so I consider sort of the family, and part of the Let's Talk series, which I'll talk a little bit about, I see the family as really the buffer and the place where kids derive their sense of groundedness of who they are. And so part of it, given where we, the current times in which we're living, where racism is alive, real, and very volatile, how do we in our families, not just in families where there is a child of color, but in all families and white families as well, how do we provide the information in a developmentally appropriate way and the sense of groundedness that who they are is exactly who they need to be. I think it's really, so I'll share one really quick story. I grew up in Hawaii where I saw everyone who looked like me. My teachers were Asian, my politicians, our leaders were my mirror. And so I grew up with that as my representation. So I'm raising 2 biracial kids in Utah, and they are getting questions that I never got about, like, what are you? And really starting to become aware, like at a very young age. My son was about 3 years old when he started asking me why he didn't have blue eyes and wished that he had blue eyes. And there was a day where we were watching the show called Fresh Off the Boat, and he was really young. The show was really not appropriate for him in terms of the humor, but he ran across he was running and he stopped and he stared at the television and he goes, oh, that's my bowl. And so there was like this sort of generic sort of bowl that you get at Chinese restaurants, this sort of plastic with red kind of design. And he stood there for a second. He goes, that's our bowl, that's our bowl. And I realized for a second how much, kids are noticing so many things where they're looking for ways that show kind of their sense of belongingness, that they should be where they are, that they belong in that school, they belong in that that store, they belong in that gymnastics class. And when they don't get a lot of that, it's really up to the family to make sure that there is an environment where they're fully seen. So I know I kind of went off on a little tangent there, but I hope, Allison, that sort of...
No, I just want to say I appreciate that, because I've been asking a lot of questions, especially recently. Now that she's 2, she's starting to vocalize more things, and I think she's a very curious little soul anyways, more than normal. But it's important to me that because I'm Caucasian, I was raised around the world. My mom was in the army, so I saw all kinds of, so I've learned to appreciate that. I just want her to always feel comfortable in who she is. And so I feel like you made some really good points that I didn't even think about. So thank you. Like, I really do. This training actually came at a time when I really needed it. So I'm appreciative of this. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Yeah. There's no handbook for this. And I think one of the take-home points too is that we all sort of we stumble through these conversations. We never know when we're going to have the conversation with our kids about race. And so part of that is just being kind to ourselves too, and recognizing that we might not have all the answers, but that I'll share some tips for building that cultural fortitude.
Karen?
Yeah.
There's been some conversation about a time and space when we used to refer to one another in terms of a color, but also some comments that color also seems to tell people within a statutory of color. She was referring to the Asian culture, that depending on your color also tells you where you fall in line in that group. Maybe she could talk more to that, but I thought that was an interesting comment.
Yeah.
This is Jan Nishimoto. So I'm from Hawaii too.
Hi.
And but I'm Chinese, Japanese, a fourth Chinese. And so color, even though not from my mom, but from my older aunties, it was always important to stay as white as you possibly could. And I have a cousin who is the same mix as I am. She browns way darker, and it's always been an issue. And people ask her, "Are you Filipino?" And she's like so offended. She's so mad that they even ask that question. And so I think that there is, like in other cultures, other places, there's also a pecking order with regards to color. Like the whiter you are, the more noble or something like that. And so it's being aware that it's not only in the United States, but that it's other cultures too that have the same bias.
Absolutely.
And that I think our problem too is that we think we've been brainwashed with the melting pot theory. Yeah. And I think that we're not a melting pot, but we're actually a stew.
Yeah.
You know, once a carrot, always a carrot, but you bring the carrot flavor in with you.
I love that.
And I think that the melting pot thinks of us as a cheese that we all blend together, and we don't. And there's a lot of shame and blame when you don't blend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much. Thank you for sharing that. So the term colorism is something that is sort of across all cultures so that same study, a variation of that study. So that study that I just showed you on the video stemmed from the 1950s, 60s, the Clark doll study, where children were asked to sort of identify which doll is better, more beautiful. And they've done that in many other countries where there's a different history of race and racism. But the idea of colorism, where lighter skin, blonder hair, blue eyes is considered sort of the top. And the darker you are, the less attractive you are. And then intellect is also sort of applied. And so you're absolutely right that colorism exists in all places. And I have similar sort of conversations with my own relatives about with skin color, even within our own sort of family. And my kids who are biracial, my husband is white. One of the first things that relatives said when my kids were born was, "Oh my gosh, they're so beautiful. Look how light they are." And so the message then, I'm like, I've been doing some of this research for a long time and, talked about this quite a bit. So I had lots of things to say back, but that is the message that continues in so many other racial ethnic groups. And I love your idea of like not a melting pot, but a stew. Yeah.
I have a question, or actually it's interesting. We're all blonde and blue eyes and, but my kids come home from school, and this is when they were younger, and one was in ninth grade and one was like in sixth grade, and there was a pair of twins, and one turned out black and one turned out white, and they're sitting at the table just having snacks, and they say to me, "Wouldn't it suck to look like so and so?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, why was that?" Because I'm still not quite picking up that I knew they were twins, but that one was black and one was white. And he goes, "Because he's the white one." And now remember, my kids are white with blonde hair. I mean, as blonde as you can get toe heads and blue as you can get eyes. We are, and I wasn't offended at all. I was just shocked. And I said, "Well, why is that?" And they go, "Well, first of all," which is really kind of racial, but they're like, they're more athletic. And second of all, they're just better looking than us white people. And then I thought to myself, what have I done as a mother that has taught them? Because I've been all inclusive with, everyone. But it was just interesting that they both agreed that they wouldn't want to be the white one. They wanted to be the black one. So I think that it's what you don't have. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm just meeting, I can't
Sally.
see.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm looking lovely today, so I haven't.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you for that comment, because I think that, when we hear conversations that our kids are having, that's like such a great opportunity to explore a little kind of what's behind some of their thinking and opinions about that. And, I think that a couple of things come to mind is sort of their response was, people like us who are blonde hair, blue eyed are less good looking and less athletic. And so, we have, it's sort of this sort of mixed, how should I say, there's a tension there as well. Because one of the things that we want to explore with our kids is around sort of categorizing based on how people look. So then if someone is black, I work with a lot of college students, and oftentimes, they're asked the question, "Are you here on like a sports scholarship?" And that is sort of the first impression that people have when they see someone who's black in a college setting. And so sort of the associations that we make, and there's no judgment there. These are just sort of, when I hear kids talk about this, I'm like, their visual diet that they get about what particular groups of people sort of are and where they fit in within society is often very, very small, and the range is very much restricted, especially for people of color. And so, one thing to sort of ask and think about is, why wouldn't his brother, who appears white, be just as athletic? And the other parts to sort of explore is, the idea, and I hear this a lot in my own classes around when I teach my multicultural counseling class, is I ask them, do white people have a culture? And people are like, "No, we don't have culture. We're bland, we're boring, we don't have it, And so there's sort of this sort of self sort of deprecation around that, like, "Oh, I'm so boring, I don't have anything." But that sort of narrative also comes from our history of racism. Because the term white is, again, the idea of social constructs, a social construct. was alongside the word white is also loss, ethnic sort of washing away of ethnicity, and people's, I mean, everyone has ethnic roots, but part of the United States and the way we maintain racism is that people gave up their ethnic background to be white, to be a part of the superior, to be on top, right? And so when kids say, I'm just so boring, I don't want to be that. So there's both this questioning of that is also racism at work. That is also internalized as I'm just a part of everybody else. I'm the norm, and everybody else who doesn't look like me is other.
The other interesting thing is my son is and has been with a Black woman for years, and they'll end up getting married. And, you know, I asked him why Black was better at athletics than white, and they had studied up on it, and they said that their Achilles is longer, tendon is longer than white. And I don't know if it's true or not, but they, I mean, you know, it's just really interesting. So that was just my point of view. I just thought it's pretty interesting. But they really don't, I mean, they're all cultural. My daughter's a school teacher and she's gay, but she is all about everybody being equality and just, I mean, all about it.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I think that there's so many layers to this of how we kind of get information and how information around race and how it, but at the end of the day is how it's upheld as a real thing. Right? I'm gonna, I know that there might be more questions, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about how, because I think Sally, what you bring up is just around how racial identity develops, and we all have a race. And we all have a way in which our own racial identity develops. And one way in which this happens is the experience, the day-to-day experience that we're either viewed as distinct or not distinct that informs our racial identity. It's not about a shared culture. It's about sort of our difference and similarity in comparison to whatever is dominant. The other piece is about representation. So I mentioned a little bit about my own upbringing, like noticing who's in power, who's considered attractive. When we talk about what's beautiful, what's handsome, you know, what are the terms that we use? How are people from a specific group treated? What we're observing? How, you know, the books that we read, the movies that we watch. So many of the characters. I mean, I think the Oscars have gone through a lot of growing pains around representation and many other contexts as well. Like, who do I see in the media? This all shapes our racial identity. And of course, you know, for many of us, we know that peers highly influence who we believe we are. So there's a wonderful book called Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And it's such a phenomenal book that I highly recommend to everyone to read about racial identity. I'm going to walk through these parallel paths that we all walk through. And I say parallel because they are both similar and a chasm apart in terms of the day-to-day experience. So many of you have heard the term BIPOC recently, and so that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And so the first sort of the mauve-colored path is an aggregate in some ways. I've drawn from various racial identity models to describe an experience and path that people go through who are BIPOC. And then for white folks, a similar path, but very different sort of psychological and emotional experience. And so let's start with BIPOC. And I also want to just say that it's not a linear thing, that our experiences of racial identity development is not linear, that we can move back and forth and around and all over the place, because new things happen to us every day. We see something that changes us, and so we're always moving and growing. So in the beginning, however, the idea that an individual, a BIPOC individual and a white individual will say, well, everyone is the same. We're all the same. We're all human. I don't see color. And then we may move for BIPOC individuals to start to notice, and this happens fairly young, fairly early. So the first doll studies, so it's with actual dolls with a black and white doll, were done with 3-year-olds. And at age 3, kids are already identifying good things with the white doll and bad things with the black doll. So they're noticing that I'm treated differently from white people. Then we move into, and this sometimes happens in maybe middle school, high school for BIPOC folks, that racism is everywhere. Everywhere they turn, they see racism happening. And so this then leads to, I only feel comfortable around people of my own race or other BIPOC individuals because they get my experience, they understand me. I don't want to be around white people, they don't get me. They don't understand my experience of racism. So you might see more of this wanting to be within group. At some point, BIPOC, the part of development is like, wait a minute, yeah, I have a racial identity, but I have other pieces of me that make me who I am. I'm also a woman. I am also Chinese. We can talk about sort of religious identity. We can talk about sexuality. There's so many other pieces that make me who I am. And so there's exploration around that. And then maybe in moments of time, maybe for longer periods of time, there's an appreciation of all the aspects of who I am, and I matter. Wherever I go, I'm so much more than my skin color, my hair type, my phenotype. I'm a lot more than that, and I matter. The parallel sort of experience of identity development for white people in the United States is maybe starting the same, that everyone is the same. Then there might be this realization like, okay, I see some stuff that's happening and I'm around peers who are talking about racism. I think they're way too sensitive. I don't really think racism is a big deal. I mean, we had a black president. We're post-racial. I think that they're making it a big deal. And then that moves into something a little bit more sort of fervent around racism is a thing of the past. Slavery is over. Something happens, with some folks where they start to have very authentic relationships. This could be in high school and college. It's a little bit later for many white individuals, where they start to feel this sense of shame when they realize how bad racism is. And we are seeing that real time right now. So much of conversation in our socio-political climate, there's a narrative around, I didn't realize how bad it is. And then on the other side, the parallel across the chasm, Black folks are saying, what do you mean you didn't know how bad racism is? It's been, 400 plus years, and it hasn't really gotten much better in my experience. And so you see there's this disconnect. And then we move into this understanding and acceptance. I have white skin privilege and benefit from racism. And here's where we do a lot of unpacking as well, because when we use the word privilege, often what comes to mind is sort of what you're afforded. And I have lots of really good conversations with students about this idea that, let's say someone says, I came from a working class, poor background, and I had to earn everything and work for everything that I earn, and I work really hard. And that is true. But we're having two conversations. we're having a conversation about social class, and we're having a conversation about race. And so while the two are intersecting, because they do overlap, what we're talking about here is white skin privilege. And all of the sort of ways in which people with who are identified as white and described and defined as white move in the same spaces as BIPOC folks and have very different experiences because of their white skin privilege. And then another point of sort of realization and development is I have a responsibility to confront racism, and racism is a cost to everyone. And how do we work toward anti-racist sort of policy, behaviors, interactions? Thoughts, questions?
I have a good one from Hannah, who is a woman I know, and she's an incredibly thoughtful person. And she says, it feels like that in order to change the view of Black is bad, we are now being told we have to say white is bad. I know that isn't what we're trying to do, but that's how it feels.
Yeah. We live in such a binary sort of system where we you know, some economists talk about it as a zero-sum game, that there can't be a both and, that it's either we shift everything over to one side in order to make change. And I think that that is also sort of the emotional experience of shame and guilt, is that recognizing marginalized people's experience and really seeing it for what it is, we can't help but then also internalize that as then that means that I'm bad. Right. And so I'd like to encourage us to talk about this idea of racism as a collective sort of task to confront. That we are all, every single one of us, has lost a lot because of racism. And that we, you know, just sort of as individuals, we didn't create the system. However, we all perpetuate it, and we all collude with a lot of the ways in which particular institutions and systems work. So moving away from like bad and good, or us versus them, or in order for other people to rise up, I need to like self-criticize and take the one down, is how do we join in conversations and heal? And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But I think that before we even get there, and I think this is more like the psychologist, mental health side of me, is that there's so many feelings around this. And acknowledging all of the emotions, and that we need to sort of make space for that before we can then really do some action.
Karen, can I ask you a question from the audience? They were wondering, we have a lot of children with a big diversity of skin color and other things, and people approach frequently asking us, are they mixed or how they're related? Help us know, how can we role model for our children who are in their presence, how to answer those intrusive types of questions? What do we say?
Good question. So initially, it's like the deer in headlights is the vision that comes up for me when you're like, oh gosh, okay, there's so many thought bubbles. Which one do I pick? Where it's none of your darn business, and what gives you the right to ask? That's so intrusive, right? There's like one end of the spectrum. On the other hand, you answer them politely. Oh yeah, you know, they're multiracial, they're Black and white and Latinx, and you know. But then what about somewhere in the middle where we place it back on the person? So I'm curious about, you know, kind of what's behind that question. Oh, yeah. So what makes you, what makes you wonder that? I'm curious. And so maybe that's the sort of irreverent side of me where I kind of want to put it back on the other person. And so that's one idea. And I also imagine so part of my Let's Talk series was like, I got a lot of tips from parents, because I am by no means the expert on all of these sort of unexpected interactions. So I encourage folks to put in your chat some other ways in which you have responded. And Terry, maybe you can share some of those out loud.
They're silent. Oh, here they come.
Okay.
This one says, my mom would say, why do you want to know? So,
Any others?
this one says, I'm Filipino Chinese and do not appear dominant to one culture. So when people have approached and asked her, she says, I'm from California.
Yeah, exactly. There's a super fun YouTube video called Where Are You From? It's a very, very funny skit. And I think many of you might enjoy it. It's the response to that question of where are you from? Where are you really from? For a lot of folks, particularly Latinx and Asian Americans, get a lot of that question of what are you? Where are you from? And then most times the answer, I'm from Hawaii, is not really sufficient to the asker. So then they follow up, they double down, no, where are you really from? And then sometimes I'm like, Hilo, Hawaii. But then you go even further and no, where are your ancestors from? And so really, I think that this desire, I think it's a human sort of wish to be able to categorize everyone and figure out and be able to place people. It's just human nature, but there's so many implications for that when it comes to identity and race. So one of this question happened when I wasn't around, and so I've sort of prepped because my son brought it to my attention that it happened in school where he was asked that by an adult. And so I get just sort of sarcastic and I just say, tell them you're a human being from Earth, and just cut it off. Because I think that for kids, they feel this desire or this need to for approval from adults to say the right thing. And so if we prep them with some sort of quick back pocket response, that they have it ready to go. And maybe it's not the best way to go, but part of my sort of leaning as a parent is you don't need to be fielding those questions of your otherness and sort of made to feel different. Well, he said he felt super weird by that interaction. So why is it important, this idea of racial identity development and developing a positive racial identity, being kind of getting to this place of appreciation of who we are and all that who we are, and recognizing our race and all the other aspects of our identity. There have been numerous studies that have looked at how that impacts kids, from higher self-esteem, more positive peer relationships, lower depression, substance abuse, anxiety or behavior problems, social emotional well-being, academic success. And this is across the board. It's for all. It's for, both having a positive sense of who we are as BIPOC kids and adults, white kids and adults, recognizing all of our identities and the implications that they have in relationships, leads to general better well-being.
So Karen, a question was asked, why do we want to be sarcastic? Why don't we want to tell them what the child's ethnicity is or what ours is, to celebrate maybe our diversity?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I think that, you know, some of these questions have an underlying sort of message for kids of color in particular. That for some of us who get asked that question, and I have to say that there's even some differences between me and my parents, because I grew up here, was born and raised in the United States. And so for my parents, they opt like, why don't you just tell them, you know, you're Chinese? The question within the United States and when it's asked and who it's asked by has sometimes implicit meaning behind that. And what it could often mean when asked by someone who's white to a visible kid of color is, what are you? You're a foreigner. You're an other. Might not be the case because we can't read minds, but it's sort of this pattern of sort of day-to-day accumulation of those kinds of questions. Whereas white children aren't asked, what are you? Where are you from? Maybe they get asked, oh, what neighborhood do you live in? Or where do where do you live? But the question of where are you from does not have as much of a loaded meaning. And then again, I want to say that these questions are often asked. We need to consider the context in which it's asked, because when you are really, really close friends, the kinds of questions that you ask each other are a lot more intimate, and you have a trusting relationship where you understand the person's intentions a little bit more. And so it's different between friendships and people who are close than there are between strangers.
Thank you.
Just a comment related to that, because I also think, like you said, with strangers, it's different. Because my friend and I were discussing this morning. They're like, because my daughter, like I said, she's mixed race, that if depending on which features they take, sometimes they're considered not enough of whatever culture. So like if I tell people that my daughter's black, they're like, no, she's not, because her hair's not dark. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's another thing too, like you said, in the context, because everybody has a different view on what's considered enough, or like, so, and I took a class really from someone at the U. I'm a psychology student up there. And I actually think it might've been from you. And we talked about how children of various races, especially mixed race, that by the year 2020, that's going to be the majority of the population. Like almost everybody is going to fit into that category of multi-raced, and so I think sometimes if we need to educate, not just, but in the way that we look at it is why, while it's important to appreciate the differences and the things that are beautiful, we don't have to look at it as a negative, because so much of the world is already going that direction.
Absolutely. Yes, I think that we want to make sure that difference or multiracial, I mean, just the idea that it's not negative. Yeah, definitely want to make sure that that is not a message that we are sending. And that difference is something that we want to be able to notice and talk about openly, that it's not a taboo thing. It's more the silence around not talking about it that creates this sort of understanding that it's bad to be different. It's bad to point out race. It's bad to talk about someone's cultural background. I'm noticing the time, and so I was going to kind of move forward. I wanted to share a little bit of an interview conversation that I had with Weston and Brandon, who are white parents who've adopted 2 Black children, and some of the ways in which our conversation that we had about how they talk to kids about race.
Welcome to Let's Talk, a show about talking to kids about race and racism. I'm your host, Karen Tao. In this episode, I meet with Brandon and Weston, who are raising their 2 adopted Black children, Xander, age 9, and Zoe, age 5. They talk about the struggle to raise children with different experiences.
He is perceived by the entire world differently than certainly I was growing up. It scares me to death to be raising a Black boy who's going to become a teenager.
And the importance of involving the greater community in these discussions. We've been talking a lot about how can we keep Xander safe, how can we keep Zoe safe, and the onus is not on them. The onus is on everybody else. Before you adopted your children, kind of what were some of the conversations you had about race?
I think, thinking of ourselves as being very, socially aware and conscious about social justice issues and those sorts of things, we had the privilege of not having to deal with those issues at all. And so when it came down to having conversations about kids, I remember getting the form that when we were adopting that basically said, what sort of races would you consider when adopting? And it was down to, what was it? I thought it was even more than that, but it was like, would you be okay with a quarter Asian, a quarter Black, a quarter Hispanic? Like it was, which is such a weird thing to even consider. We very much had sort of a colorblind attitude towards it because we're just like, well, of course, whatever, it doesn't matter to us, it'll be great.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting conversation because there was literally a grid and you had to check the boxes and it was, I don't know, to think of race in that way. I'd never sort of drilled down and thought so deeply about that component of it.
Absolutely.
But we certainly didn't at that point consider everything that question was really asking us.
Right.
It was really a very heavy thing.
Piece of paper, and it was all, like you said, theoretical.
Yeah, it was all theoretical. We had no idea what decision we were actually making at that point. It was, we wanted a baby and it didn't matter. Yeah. But I'm glad that there were other steps along the way that better prepared us.
Right. Tell me a little bit more about how those conversations shifted.
Actually, it was more for our second adoption than it was for our first, where a home study agency that required that we take some courses, and there was one that was talking about race and adoption, and interracial adoption, or transracial adoption. It was giving some tips on how to better prepare you for dealing with issues that might come up related to race, and what to do to better support your children. And it had some suggestions like, it tiered it in coming up with, the first tier thing you can do is, I think, as you hire professionals in your life, whether it's your pediatrician or whatever, you look for people of color who can be in your kids' lives.
When growing up, that's not something we had to ever think about. And then when you have kids, you have to be a lot more intentional and a lot more deliberate about everything that you do, from who you hire and who you bring into your life. And it feels odd because, you don't want to feel like, hey, I'm making friends with this person because they can, be that racial mirror to my child. But at the same time, you've got to be deliberate about getting and finding those resources so that they do have those, especially here in a community like Utah where it can be a little bit more difficult.
We can say every single day to our kids, you are so beautiful and your skin is so beautiful and your hair is so beautiful, and we do. But if everyone they're looking at and everyone they're seeing every single day does not look like them, or they're exposed to media. In fact, we've read Snow White and to Zoe, and I changed the words as we're reading it because it talks about how beautiful her white skin is. It's it's white as snow.
White as snow again.
Right, and so it's. You realize when you become aware that that's something you want to try to bring into your child's life, you realize that the first step is cleansing what you have, because there's so much of it that puts on a pedestal something that they can never be.
Right.
And says that this is what is beautiful, and you can't be that. And what a horrible message to send to kids.
And and at home, certainly, you just pick up these books and you don't realize until you sort of sit down and think about how is my child taking this message in, because it's going to be very different than the way I see it. People creating this media, do it from sort of a white perspective, and they don't even necessarily think about the racial component to it. And asking yourself, is this piece of media, is this book, is this video, is this reinforcing stereotypes, or is this something that is sending positive messages to my kids?
We can sort of shield our kids from some of this and kind of think about like what should we bring into our house and not bring into our house. And then they're at school. There's a lot of stuff that happens on the playground, and I wondered, have there been conversations that you've had with Xander and Zoe that they've brought home and initiated with you about race?
We're exploring, helping him learn better and the learning issues that he might have in school. And when things like that come up, where it's maybe suggested by a teacher that he needs more attention, you can't help but wonder, is my kid unusual, or is this? Are you noticing him more? I don't know. It's just an awareness that we're trying to have, so that if something were to come up, we can address it. But it's hard. It's so gray that it's hard to figure out where those comments and suggestions are coming from. Because we've read things that talk about how kids of color are disciplined more, and the school to prison pipeline.
Sure.
So we're
statistically, you have a lot of sort of proof for this disproportionate number of especially black and brown boys who are targeted.
It's hard to just, as any parent with any kid, to see how they're experiencing life and how they're going through their school experience, but to do it when our experience was very different than their experience. And so I feel like we're hyper aware.
Yeah.
And always on the lookout.
I want to keep showing, they offer so much great advice and their own experience. I encourage you to watch it. I provided that link for you all.
Welcome to...
So to close our time today, I wanted to provide you with just some broad tips and ways to sort of think about how we develop this idea of cultural fortitude, which I define as mental, emotional, and interpersonal strength in the face of cultural discomfort and pain. It sparks courage to move toward racial and cultural repair and healing. And so I really like a lot of the questions that folks have asked about, there's so much information out there, and is there a way to do this? And I think my sort of broad answer is there are many ways to approach how we build cultural fortitude. And so here I'd like to offer just some of them. So the first is, what is your own understanding of race and racism? A big part of having conversations with kids and other folks in our lives is to really know kind of how we define it, how we think about it, our own upbringing, how did we talk about race and racism, and how that might influence the way that we have these conversations with our children. Another is to become comfortable with terminology. The beauty of the internet is that there's so much wonderful stuff out there, resources out there. I'll share a few with you at the end just to kind of get started. The Let's Talk webpage also offers some resources. So I think one of the my mantra, especially as a therapist, is when your child brings up race, keep the conversation going, sustain that conversation. When they bring it up, and it's not so much about like having the right thing to respond to or say the right thing, but it could even be things like, because kids bring stuff up in the middle of the grocery store or in public when maybe you don't really want to have that conversation right there, but some back pocket responses are like, that is such a wonderful question. And I know many of you use this in many other contexts, but that is such a great question that I really want to talk with you about it. Let's get in the car, or let's do this tonight before we go to bed. Let's make sure we talk about it. Or if the time is right, to really explore with open-ended questions and curiosity. On the other side of things, you might ask questions and initiate discussion when you're reading a book together. about the ways characters are depicted, ask them what they're thinking and feeling. You're watching a show, ask them sort of what they're noticing, really getting them to start, having the language for describing the ways that people kind of interact with each other. Our children are our best teachers as well. They see things that, as adults, we have so many things going on. We're multitasking, and kids sort of have this, and because their brains are sponges, they are taking in so much. And so they are going to teach us things and observe things that we don't see, so we can follow their lead and trust them to guide us too. Involve children in activities and learning that focus on race and cultural diversity. So here's another piece where earlier I showed you that study where people have a really hard time, using the words black and white when describing people. And here's another side, like I'm adding more complexity to this, in that we also want to ask questions to increase critical thinking, because when we say, oh, that black woman over there, or that Asian woman over there, we use that a lot when we're describing folks with racial minoritized identities. And they might talk about their kids, their fellow peers and classes in that sort of racialized ways, which is fine. But the part of critical thinking is, tell me a little bit more about that person. What do they like to do? Why are they your friend? And so that helps with the complexity of seeing people as more than their phenotype and seeing them more as complex humans. Learn when to pause, move on, and continue. So in many conversations that can feel kind of emotionally sort of stirring, we will notice when our kids are done. I know, I tend to get on my little teacher hat on, and with my kids, they want to engage me and I want to keep going, and then I see their eyes glaze over, or I feel them get silent. And then sometimes for kids, we just have to stop and pause, maybe check back later, but that there is sort of a moderation around how much we want to kind of push the conversation to. Find other people around you, other adults, other family members to learn with and from each other, to connect, have conversations with them as well. Humility is a big piece. We're gonna make mistakes. I say lots of things that I wish I had said differently, but nothing's ever a deal breaker. We can always go back to our kids and ask them, hey, when I said that, I don't think that I said it the way I wanted to. Can I share what I'm thinking now? Or if they ask a question and we don't know the answer to around race, we can say, you know what? I am still learning about this too. Let's read together. Let's find out. Another piece is to speak up and challenge systemic inequity, to be able to model for our kids. And that is a big part of repairing a lot of the damage and consequences of racism, is by little finding spaces or interactions or acts of repair that our kids can see us doing and learn from. And finally, building cultural fortitude is also about healing. There's a lot of pain around this concept of race and about the realities of racism. And there's so much joy. There's the racial differences, there's so much joy around there, so much magic around difference. And so let's make space for all of it. Here are a few of my favorite resources that I go to. So We Need Diverse Books is a great one, where you can find age-appropriate books about specific topics. So, many of us are in quarantine, and I just looked up a bunch and went to the library and borrowed a bunch for my kids. Embrace Race is a wonderful organization that engages in a lot of discussion, and they invite parents to come, and there are live webinars and discussions that people are invited to. So Embrace Race is great. Teaching Tolerance, many teachers know about. Many folks, they have so many resources on activities, on discussion guides, on movies to watch, on it's an amazing organization. The Conscious Kid is a great one. And then the NPR Life Kit. And then finally, I have one book that I just bought recently and I just adore. It's called Intersection Allies. We Make Room for All. It's a beautiful children's book. And it talks about this concept of intersectionality. And it's for kids. So I know that we are at our time for today. I will leave it up to Terry and Liz if we wanted to have a couple of questions, or you are free to email me at my email address here. And then I also share my website.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. That was remarkable. And if you could see the chat, I know you're focused on your presentation and not so much the chat, because that's where your attention is, but just a remarkable amount of conversation that went on today. And one thing that you said that I love is that this is an ongoing conversation. This isn't the end. And I think you have given us a very good start to follow through with as we move forward and continue to discuss these very complex, the questions that came up. I think it really reflects the complexity and the desire of people to get it right. Maybe there isn't one right way to get it, but we keep working on it. And I think that's one of the biggest things.
It's a process for sure. Would it be possible to, I know that sometimes you can save a chat. I would just love to be able to kind of get a sense of kind of what came up. It will help me in my own learning to see folks' questions, and even though I couldn't respond to them today.
Okay, absolutely. And we usually do save the chats from all these sessions, so I will send you a copy of those chat messages. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Sorry, Liz, I just want to ask a quick question. It's relevant. We're looking here at your email address. It says culture and we're missing an I. Is that intentional?
No, it's my, it's diversity. It's supposed to be with an I there.
Okay, so add the I in there, folks.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you for catching that.
Yeah, I didn't catch that at all. I think we just kind of know what it's supposed to say, so we just kind of gloss over that.
I know.
Good catch. Well, thank you, Dr. Tao. Once again, we incredibly appreciate your time with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing this space with me too.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.